For the entire world, she was just another poor elderly woman of 93 years old, sitting silently in her worn velvet armchair while life happened around her. Her own children talked about her as if she weren't there, openly discussing which nursing home had the fastest available vacancy, which one accepted patients without advance reservation, as if they were choosing where to store an old piece of furniture that no longer fit in the house. Rose Eleanor Harper felt the cold of true fear in her tired bones. Not the fear of death, she'd made peace with that long ago, had held Henry's hand as he'd taken his last breath 3 years earlier. She feared something far worse than death. She feared disappearing while still alive, being forgotten in an empty white corridor, far from the flowers she'd planted herself with hands that still remembered how soil felt, far from the memories that still made her smile when she let herself remember, far from the life that still pulsed stubbornly inside her at 93. They thought she had no strength left to fight anything. They thought her fate was completely sealed by a signed contract, by stamped documents, by decisions made without consulting her, as if her 9 decades of life experience counted for nothing. But what those children didn't know, what nobody in their comfortable certainty could imagine, is that behind those tired and apparently resigned eyes, Rose Eleanor Harper was silently plotting something that would change everything. On the scheduled day when they finally came to take her to the nursing home they'd chosen, they found the house completely silent, lights off, armchair empty. Rose wasn't there, waiting like an obedient old woman who'd accepted her fate. She didn't go to the nursing home they'd selected without asking her opinion, and she didn't get lost confused in the world, as they immediately feared when they couldn't find her. She did something so completely unexpected, so bold for a 93-year-old woman, that it would leave her children in absolute shock and prove once and for all that a truly determined woman is never poor, never weak, and never too old to take back control of her own life. If you've ever felt the world decided your fate without asking you, if you've been treated as invisible just because of your age, if you've ever needed to prove you still own your own story, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Rose did when she disappeared that dawn will make you believe it's never ever too late to choose how to live your own days. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. This is the story of the 93-year-old woman who transformed her greatest fear into her greatest and most unexpected victory. Rose Eleanor Hayes had been 21 years old when she'd met Henry Harper at a church social in 1952. He'd been 24, recently back from Korea, working as an apprentice carpenter and looking for a fresh start. They'd talked for 3 hours that first night, and Rose had known with surprising certainty that this quiet man with kind eyes and careful hands was going to be important in her life. They'd married 6 months later in a simple ceremony that Rose's mother had called too rushed, but that felt exactly right to both of them. It had been a good marriage. Not perfect. No marriage spanning 65 years could claim perfection, but good. They'd built a life together through decades of change and challenge. 3 children born in the 1950s and 60s. Richard, Margaret, Thomas. A modest house purchased in 1958 on Maple Street, where they'd raised those children and grown old together. Henry's carpentry business that had supported them comfortably, if not extravagantly. Rose's work as a seamstress from home, taking in alterations and custom work, contributing to the family finances while managing the household. They'd been partners in the truest sense. Henry had never dismissed Rose's opinions or treated her as less capable. He'd consulted her on business decisions, valued her practical wisdom, respected her intelligence. In an era when many men expected their wives to be silent and obedient, Henry had treated Rose as an equal. That respect, that partnership, had been the foundation of everything they'd built together. Now, at 93, Rose sat in the velvet armchair Henry had bought her for their 30th anniversary and watched her adult children treat her the way Henry never had, as someone whose opinions didn't matter, whose autonomy was negotiable, whose life could be decided for her by people who thought they knew better. Rose had turned 93 on a Tuesday in March, surrounded by her 3 adult children, 7 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren who'd gathered dutifully at her small house on Maple Street. The cake had been store-bought, the singing perfunctory, the visits brief. Everyone had busy lives, important places to be, schedules to maintain. Rose had smiled and thanked them, and waved goodbye from her porch, and then she'd sat in her worn velvet armchair and felt profoundly, devastatingly alone in a way that had nothing to do with being physically by herself. Henry had been gone for 3 years now. 3 years since the massive heart attack that took him quickly one morning while he was working in their garden, pruning the roses he'd always maintained so carefully. 3 years of Rose living in the house they'd shared for 6.5 decades, maintaining her independence, managing her own life, proving to herself and everyone else that she was still capable, still present, still here, and functional and worthy of respect. She'd been doing fine, more than fine, actually. More. She had her routines that gave structure to her days, her garden that connected her to the earth and the seasons, her weekly card games with the few friends who were still alive and mobile enough to meet. She cooked her own meals, managed her own medications with a pill organizer and reminder system, kept the house clean enough. Yes, she moved slower than she used to, her joints protesting every morning until she got moving. Yes, she needed reading glasses and couldn't hear quite as well as before, especially in noisy environments. But her mind was sharp as ever, her memory for important things remained excellent, and her will to live on her own terms had never wavered even slightly. But her children, Richard, Margaret and Thomas, all in their 60s now with their own health concerns and life complications, had been having conversations about her. Rose knew this because she'd overheard snatches of their phone calls, caught the worried glances they exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking, noticed how they'd started visiting more frequently with what felt like inspection tours rather than social visits. "Mom, are you sure you're taking your medications correctly? Have you missed any doses? Mom, what would you do if you fell and couldn't reach the phone? Do you have your medical alert button on? Mom, have you thought about what happens when you can't manage the stairs anymore? When the yard work becomes too much?" At first, Rose had reassured them patiently, shown them her systems, demonstrated her competence. Then she'd gotten annoyed at the constant questioning, the implicit distrust. Then she'd gotten genuinely scared, because she realized they weren't asking questions to help her solve problems or to understand her capabilities. They were building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to make a decision for her rather than with her, treating her increasing age as inevitable incompetence rather than simply requiring some adaptations. The Tuesday after her 93rd birthday, her children called a family meeting. Rose knew what it was about before they even sat down in her living room. Richard in Henry's old leather recliner, like he had the right to sit there, Margaret on the sofa with papers and brochures spread around her, Thomas perched nervously on the ottoman, looking uncomfortable but going along with his older siblings. Rose sat in her velvet armchair and waited for the verdict she knew was coming, her heart beating faster, but her face carefully composed. "Mom," Richard began, his voice taking on that carefully patient tone people use with children, and the very old, "We've been talking among ourselves, and we think it's time to have an honest discussion about your living situation." "My living situation is fine," Rose said calmly, though her hands were trembling slightly in her lap. "I live here, in my house, as I have for 65 years. "But Mom," Margaret jumped in, her face arranged in the expression of concerned sympathy she'd perfected, "you're 93 years old. You're living completely alone. What if something serious happens? What if you fall and can't get up? What if there's a medical emergency and nobody's here to help you?" "I have a medical alert button that I wear constantly," Rose pointed out, touching the device around her neck. "I've never fallen. I'm perfectly capable of managing my daily life without supervision." "For now," Richard interrupted, his tone suggesting that Rose's current capability was temporary and delusional. "But Mom, we have to think ahead. We have to plan for when you're not capable anymore. It's irresponsible of us not to make arrangements while you can still adjust to changes." "Irresponsible," Rose repeated quietly, the word landing like a slap. Her children were calling it irresponsible to allow her to continue living independently. "We've been looking at some really nice facilities," Margaret continued, pulling out glossy brochures like a real estate agent presenting properties. "Assisted living communities with activities and medical care right on site. You'd have your own apartment, meals provided 3 times a day, people your own age to socialize with, staff available 24 hours if you need anything." "I don't want to live in a facility," Rose said, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was starting to race with genuine fear. "I want to live here, in my home." "Mom, that's just not realistic anymore," Richard said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "This house is too big for one person your age. The yard is too much work to maintain. You can't keep managing everything alone indefinitely. I've been managing just fine for 3 years since your father died." "But you won't always be fine," Thomas spoke up for the first time, his voice gentle but resolute as if he'd rehearsed this. "And we need to act while you can still adjust to a new place, before there's a crisis or emergency that forces a rushed decision. They weren't asking, they were telling. Rose looked at each of her children, the babies she'd raised, the adults she'd supported through their own struggles and failures and triumphs, the people she'd loved unconditionally for decades, and realized with crushing certainty that they'd already made the decision. This meeting wasn't a discussion or a consultation. It was a notification of what they'd decided was best for her, regardless of what she wanted. "We've actually already put your name on a waiting list at Meadowbrook Senior Living," Margaret said, not quite meeting Rose's eyes as she admitted this. "It's supposed to be one of the best facilities in the area. They have an opening coming up in about 3 weeks. We wanted to secure it before someone else took the spot." "You put my name on a list without asking me?" Rose's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, years of suppressed frustration breaking through her usually calm demeanor. "Without even consulting me about whether I wanted this?" "Mom, we're trying to help you," Richard said, his patience clearly fraying at her resistance. "We're trying to do what's best for you before something terrible happens, and we're dealing with an emergency. What's best for me is living in my own home, maintaining my own independence, making my own choices about my life." "That's not an option anymore," Richard said flatly, as if he had the authority to make that declaration. "We've made the decision. 3 weeks from now, we'll help you pack up what you want to keep in your apartment at Meadowbrook, and we'll move you to the facility. We've already paid the deposit and signed the initial paperwork." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Rose sat very still in her velvet armchair, feeling the weight of her children's collective will pressing down on her like a physical force crushing her chest. She was 93 years old. She had no leverage, no power, no voice they were willing to hear or respect. They decided she was too old to make her own choices, too fragile to live her own life, too much of a liability to be left alone. And there was nothing she could say that would change their minds. They'd made their decision, and they expected her to comply like an obedient child. After her children left, satisfied they'd handled things responsibly, secure in their decision, convinced they were doing the right thing. Rose sat in her armchair as evening shadows filled the room and darkness crept in. She looked at the house she'd made a home for 6.5 decades. The walls that held memories in every corner, birthdays and holidays and ordinary evenings. The garden visible through the window that she'd tended for years, each plant chosen and placed with care. The life she'd built here with Henry and wasn't ready to leave or surrender. And Rose Eleanor Harper, who'd been underestimated her entire life simply for being a woman, in an era that dismissed women's capabilities, who'd been silenced countless times but had learned to fight her battles quietly and strategically, who'd survived 93 years by being stronger than anyone gave her credit for, made a decision of her own that nobody expected. If her children thought 3 weeks was enough time to pack up her life and move her into a facility she didn't choose, if they thought she would simply comply with their decision without resistance, they were about to learn something important about the woman who'd raised them. Rose Eleanor Harper wasn't done making her own decisions yet, and she had options her children knew nothing about. The planning took Rose 2 full weeks of careful, quiet preparation. She knew she had to be strategic, had to think several steps ahead like a chess player, anticipating her opponent's moves. Her children visited regularly during those weeks, bringing more brochures about Meadowbrook, measuring furniture to see what would fit in the assisted living apartment, making lists of what to keep and what to sell or donate. Rose smiled and nodded and let them talk. Let them believe she'd accepted the inevitable, all while making plans of her own that would shock them to their cores. She couldn't drive anymore. Her license had been voluntarily surrendered 2 years ago when her eyesight had gotten too poor for safe operation of a vehicle, and her reaction time had slowed enough to make her nervous behind the wheel, but she could still take the bus. She looked up schedules online using the old desktop computer Henry had taught her to use before he died, patient lessons in navigating the internet that she'd initially resisted but now felt grateful for. Maple Street to the regional bus station to Asheville, Asheville to Boone. From Boone she'd figure out the last leg of the journey. She couldn't take much with her. At 93, she couldn't manage more than a single suitcase, and even that would be challenging. She packed carefully over several days, making strategic choices about what was essential. Practical clothes suitable for mountain weather, her medications with a 3-month supply she'd carefully accumulated by filling prescriptions slightly early, important documents she'd kept in a safety deposit box at the bank, including her birth certificate and marriage license and Henry's death certificate. Photos of Henry at different ages, their wedding picture, images of the children when they were young and still needed her, the worn leather journal where she'd written memories and thoughts over the decades, a record of her internal life that nobody else had ever read. And most importantly, two things she'd kept hidden and private for years, things her children knew nothing about. The first was an old iron key that Henry had given her on their 40th wedding anniversary in 1992. "For the cabin," he'd said simply, pressing it into her palm with a meaningful look. "Never forget it's there, Rose. Promise me you'll remember." She'd promised, though at the time she hadn't understood why he was being so serious about it. Now she understood perfectly. The second item was a letter Henry had written to her before he died, not the official will that had been read to the children by his lawyer, but a personal letter he'd asked his lawyer to deliver to Rose separately, 3 months after his death, giving her time to grieve before having to process what he was telling her. She'd read it so many times over the past 3 years that the paper was soft with handling, the creases deep from being folded and unfolded countless times. She knew every word by heart, but she still reread it frequently, finding comfort and strength in Henry's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Rose," it began in Henry's careful script, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope you're doing all right without me, though I know how much we relied on each other. I'm writing this because I know our children. I love them. They're good people in many ways, but I know them. And I know that eventually, probably sooner than either of us would like, they'll try to put you somewhere safe where they don't have to worry about you. They'll think they're helping. They'll convince themselves they're doing the right thing. And you'll feel like you have no choice but to go along with what they want, because that's what you've always done. Put everyone else's needs and wants before your own, accommodated everyone else's preferences, made yourself small so others could be comfortable. But Rose, my darling, I'm giving you a choice. I'm giving you an option they don't know about. Do you remember the cabin? Our secret place in the Blue Ridge Mountains that we never told anyone about, not even the kids? It's still there, and it's still ours. Or rather, it's yours now. I've been paying the taxes on it through a private trust for years, and I've left very specific instructions with my lawyer. The property is in your name, your maiden name, Eleanor Hayes, so the kids won't find it in any records or property searches they might do. It's yours completely, legally, with no strings attached. The cabin might need some work after 3 years of me not being there to maintain it, but it's structurally sound. I made sure of that before I got too sick to go up there anymore. I always planned for it to be a place you could go if you needed to, a place that's entirely yours where nobody can tell you how to live or what to do. If the day comes when the kids try to make decisions for you instead of with you, when they try to control your life because they think they know better, I want you to know you have options. Real options. You don't have to go where they want to send you. You can go to our place in the mountains. You can be free. You can live on your own terms. I left you enough money to live on comfortably for as long as you need. It's all in the trust, separate from the estate the kids inherited. The lawyer has all the details. And Rose, if you do decide to disappear to the cabin, don't feel guilty about it. You've spent 90+ years taking care of everyone else, me, the kids, even the grandkids when they needed you. It's your turn to take care of yourself. Live on your own terms. That's what I want for you. That's what you deserve after a lifetime of putting everyone else first. All my love, always and forever, your Henry. Rose had cried the first time she'd read that letter, and she'd cried several times since. Henry had known, even before he died, even when they were still together, he'd known their children would eventually try to control her life, and he'd made plans years in advance to give her an escape. He'd loved her enough to give her freedom. He'd respected her enough to give her choices. Now, sitting in her house 5 days before her children were scheduled to move her to Meadowbrook against her will, Rose read the letter one more time, drawing strength from Henry's words. Then she carefully folded it, placed it in her suitcase, and began the final preparations for her disappearance. She was 93 years old and she was running away from home. The irony would have made her laugh if she wasn't so terrified of what she was about to do. Rose left on a Wednesday morning at 4 a.m., hours before her children would think to check on her, in the darkness before dawn when the world was still sleeping. She'd set it up carefully, methodically, thinking through every detail. The night before, she'd told Richard she was feeling tired and would probably sleep in late the next day. "Don't come by in the morning," she'd said, making her voice sound weaker than usual. "I just need to rest. All this packing and planning has worn me out." Richard had agreed readily, probably relieved to have one less thing on his schedule, one less obligation to fulfill before work. Rose had barely slept that night. She'd been too nervous, too aware that she was about to do something that would shock everyone who thought they knew her, too keyed up with adrenaline despite her age. She'd lain in bed watching the clock, watching the hours creep by, questioning her decision, and then recommitting to it over and over. At 3:30 a.m., she got up and dressed in comfortable clothes she'd laid out the night before. Slacks with an elastic waist, a warm sweater, her sturdy walking shoes with good support, a jacket in case the mountains were cold. She made sure she had her medications in a pill case, her wallet with cash she'd been withdrawing in small amounts for weeks, her phone that Margaret had insisted she carry. She looked around her bedroom one last time, touching familiar surfaces, saying silent goodbyes to a life she might be leaving forever. The room where she and Henry had slept for 65 years, the dresser holding clothes she wouldn't be taking, the window overlooking the garden she'd tended so lovingly. At 3:50 a.m., Rose Eleanor Harper picked up her single suitcase, heavier than she'd have liked but containing everything essential, turned off the lights in her house of 6.5 decades, locked the door behind her with hands that shook slightly, and walked down Maple Street in the darkness toward the bus station 6 blocks away. She was 93 years old, moving slowly but steadily, pulling her wheeled suitcase behind her on the sidewalk, and she was running away from home before her children could imprison her in a facility she didn't choose. The absurdity of it hit her somewhere around the 3rd block, and she actually laughed out loud, the sound startling in the pre-dawn quiet. Here she was, ancient enough to have lived through World War II and Korea and Vietnam and 9/11 and a pandemic, old enough to have great-great-grandchildren if any of her grandchildren hurried up, and she was sneaking out of her house in the middle of the night like a teenager escaping strict parents. But beneath the absurd humor was genuine fear and something else, something she hadn't felt in years: exhilaration. For the first time in decades, she was making a choice entirely for herself. Consequences be damned, other people's opinions be ignored. She was acting instead of reacting, choosing instead of accepting, taking control instead of being controlled. The bus station was nearly empty at 4 a.m. Just a tired-looking clerk behind the window and 2 other travelers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Rose bought her ticket to Asheville with cash, settled onto a bench and waited, her heart racing every time someone walked in, convinced it would be Richard or Margaret come to stop her. But nobody came. At 4:55 a.m., she boarded the bus with help from the driver who took her suitcase, found a seat by the window, and watched Maple Street disappear into the distance as dawn began breaking over the horizon in shades of pink and gold. By the time her children discovered she was gone, probably around 9 or 10 a.m. when Richard stopped by to check on her, Rose would be halfway to the mountains. And by the time they figured out where she'd actually gone, if they ever managed to figure it out at all, she'd be somewhere they couldn't force her to leave. She'd be in the one place that was entirely hers, that Henry had given her, that nobody could take away as long as she was breathing. She'd be free. The journey took most of the day and tested every bit of Rose's determination and physical stamina. The bus from her town to Asheville took 3 hours, and every minute of it Rose spent in a state of heightened awareness, watching for her children, jumping at every phone ring, convinced that somehow they'd already discovered her absence and were tracking her down. The Asheville bus station required a 3-hour layover before the next connection to Boone. Rose found a corner seat, bought terrible cafeteria food she could barely eat because her stomach was in knots, and tried to look invisible. At 73, at 83, even at 90, she might have blended in better. But at 93 she stood out. People noticed her. Some looked concerned, as if wondering whether this elderly woman was lost or confused. A security guard even approached to ask if she needed help. "I'm fine," Rose assured him with her most capable smile. "Just waiting for my connection to visit family." The lie came easily. The security guard looked skeptical but didn't press further. By the time the bus to Boone finally arrived at 2 p.m., Rose was exhausted. Her body ached from sitting in uncomfortable seats, her joints protesting every movement. Her nerves were frayed from constant vigilance. But she'd made it this far, traveled hundreds of miles from home, and nobody had stopped her. She was actually doing this. The final bus took another 2 hours through increasingly mountainous terrain. Rose watched the landscape change through the window, civilization gradually giving way to forest, paved roads becoming narrower and windier, the Blue Ridge Mountains rising up around them in their ancient weathered glory. This was the North Carolina she and Henry had fallen in love with 40 years ago when they'd first found their secret place. By the time the bus pulled into Boone at 4 p.m., Rose felt like she'd aged another decade. Every part of her body hurt. She was more tired than she could remember being in years, but she'd made it. Almost. One more leg. From Boone, Rose took a taxi, an expensive luxury that made her wince at the cost, but necessary. She couldn't walk 30 miles, couldn't manage any more buses. "I need to go to a property up in the mountains," she told the driver, pulling out the old property deed Henry had left her, the address barely legible but still valid. "It's about 30 miles from here, off Route 421 near the National Forest." The driver, a young man in his 20s with kind eyes and a concerned expression, looked at her with obvious worry. "That's pretty remote, Mom. Are you sure you want to go up there? There's not much out that way. No stores, no neighbors, just forest." "I'm absolutely sure," Rose said firmly, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I'll pay you double your normal fare for the trouble." Money talked. The driver nodded, helped her into the back seat with surprising gentleness, loaded her suitcase in the trunk, and they headed up into the Blue Ridge Mountains as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Rose watched the landscape change as they climbed higher, the town of Boone giving way to scattered houses, then to pure forest, the paved roads becoming narrower, civilization falling away like layers being peeled back. This was the North Carolina that existed outside of cities and suburbs, the wild places that had been here long before people came and would be here long after. They'd been in their 50s when they'd first found this place, Rose remembered, as the taxi wound up increasingly remote roads. Henry had still been working as a contractor, building houses and businesses, his hands still strong despite decades of hard labor. Rose had still been taking in sewing work, still busy with the children who were adults, but still needing things. But they'd needed somewhere to escape to, somewhere that was just theirs, away from all the demands and expectations. They'd found this cabin almost by accident, a weekend drive through the mountains, a wrong turn down an unmarked road, and suddenly there it was, a small, weathered structure sitting on 5 acres of forest land with a view that had taken their breath away. The property had been abandoned for years, the cabin falling apart from neglect. The owner had been happy to sell it cheap to a contractor willing to fix it up. Henry had spent a year of weekends rebuilding it, making it solid and weatherproof and comfortable, Rose sometimes coming with him to help, both of them treating it like an adventure, and then it had become their secret. 2 or 3 times a year, Henry and Rose would tell the children they were taking a weekend trip, sometimes claiming it was for Henry's work, sometimes saying they were visiting old friends, and they'd disappear to the cabin. No phone service back then, no way to be reached, just the 2 of them in the mountains. It had been their sanctuary, their escape, their reminder that they were Henry and Rose before they were Mum and Dad and Mr. and Mrs. Harper and members of the community with responsibilities and roles to fulfill. They'd kept it secret because they'd needed something that was entirely theirs, that the children couldn't claim or criticize or demand access to. Even as the children grew and moved away, even when it became less necessary to hide it, they'd kept it private. It had been their place, and they'd fiercely protected that privacy. Rose hadn't been back since Henry died. She'd been afraid to face it without him, afraid it would hurt too much to be in the place they'd built together. But now, as the taxi wound up the final stretch of dirt road and Rose recognized landmarks she'd thought she'd forgotten, she felt something unexpected stirring beneath her exhaustion and fear. Coming home. "This it?" the driver asked, pulling up to an overgrown driveway marked only by a faded number on a post half hidden by vegetation. "This is it," Rose confirmed, her voice surprisingly steady. The driver helped her out carefully, watching her move with the slowness of advanced age, clearly concerned about leaving an elderly woman alone in the middle of nowhere. He carried her suitcase to the door of the cabin, looking dubious about the whole situation. "You absolutely sure you're okay here, ma'am? Want me to wait to make sure you can get inside? This place looks pretty abandoned." "I'll be fine," Rose assured him with more confidence than she felt, pulling out the old iron key Henry had given her. "This is my place. I know it well." The driver left reluctantly after Rose paid him, his taillights disappearing down the dirt road, the sound of his engine fading into the vast silence of the mountains, and then Rose was alone, completely, utterly alone, standing on the porch of the cabin as the sun set and shadows lengthened, faced with the reality of what she'd done. She was 93 years old. She'd run away from home, traveled across the state, and arrived at an abandoned cabin in the mountains with no clear plan for what came next. She was either the bravest or the most foolish person she knew, and she wasn't entirely sure which. Rose put the key in the lock and it turned smoothly despite years of disuse. Henry had maintained this place meticulously, even in death, His careful work held. She pushed the door open, reached for the light switch, and was relieved beyond measure when the lights actually came on. The electricity was still connected, the bill still being paid by whatever trust Henry had set up. She stepped inside and felt 40 years of memories wash over her like a wave. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it 3 years ago, frozen in time, waiting. And Rose Eleanor Harper, 93 years old and exhausted and terrified and free, set down her suitcase, closed the door on the darkening world outside, and finally let herself believe she'd actually done it. She'd escaped. She was here. She was free. Rose's first 3 days at the cabin were a blur of physical labor, emotional processing, and the bone-deep exhaustion of someone 93 years old who'd pushed herself far beyond normal limits. She slept 12 hours the first night, her body demanding rest it could no longer be denied. When she woke on Thursday morning, every muscle and joint in her body screamed in protest. Moving from the bed to the bathroom took concentrated effort and several minutes of careful movement. But she was here. She'd made it, and now she had to figure out how to actually live here. The cabin was dusty and cold from 3 years of being closed up, but it was structurally sound, just as Henry had promised. The windows needed cleaning, the floors needed sweeping, the kitchen needed to be scrubbed, the bathroom needed work. Rose tackled it slowly, methodically, taking frequent breaks, listening to her body's warnings when she pushed too hard. She was 93 years old and not accustomed to physical labor anymore, but she worked steadily, making slow progress, sweeping dust from corners, washing windows until light poured in properly, wiping down surfaces covered in 3 years of accumulated grime, airing out the musty-smelling rooms, opening windows despite the cool mountain air to let freshness blow through. She couldn't do much at once. 15 minutes of work would exhaust her, force her to sit and rest, but she kept at it, hour by hour, day by day. By Friday evening, she had the main living area and kitchen reasonably clean. By Saturday night, the bathroom sparkled and her few clothes were hung in the small closet. The cabin had well water from a mountain spring Henry had tapped years ago, and it still ran clear and cold when Rose turned on the faucet. The propane tank for the stove was still half full. Henry had kept it maintained even when they weren't using the place regularly. There was firewood stacked under a tarp outside, aged but still usable for the wood stove. Henry had left everything ready for exactly this scenario, Rose realized as she discovered each prepared resource. He'd known. He'd anticipated the day when she might need to disappear to this place and take care of herself, and he'd prepared for it years in advance. The realization made her cry, which she'd been doing a lot of in those first few days. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming emotions of being alone in this place that held so many memories of Henry, of feeling his presence everywhere she looked, of being grateful and heartbroken and relieved all simultaneously. She knew her children must have discovered she was gone by now. Wednesday morning, when Richard went to check on her, finding the house empty. The panic that must have ensued. Calls to Margaret and Thomas, calls to friends, calls to hospitals, maybe even calls to police. They were probably searching frantically, convinced she'd had some kind of mental break, that she was wandering confused somewhere, that she was in danger. Rose felt guilty about the worry she was causing, genuinely guilty because she wasn't a cruel person and she didn't enjoy causing pain. But she also felt something else, a grim satisfaction that they'd learned she was still capable of making her own decisions and taking decisive action, that she wasn't the helpless, incompetent old woman they'd decided she was. She'd turned off her cell phone the moment she'd arrived at the cabin on Wednesday evening. She knew they could track it if it was on, knew that Margaret had probably put some kind of tracking app on it for safety without telling her. She'd charge it periodically just to keep the battery alive, would check occasionally to see what messages they'd left, but she wouldn't turn on the location services, and she wouldn't call them back. Not yet. Not until she'd proven to herself that she could actually do this, that she was still capable of living independently, that their concerns about her were overblown and patronizing rather than legitimate. On Sunday morning, Rose woke up in the cabin as sunrise painted the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of gold and pink and lavender. She made coffee on the propane stove using supplies she'd brought, wrapped herself in a blanket Henry had bought years ago, and sat on the porch watching the world wake up around her. Birds called to each other in the trees, species she didn't know the names of, but whose songs were beautiful anyway. A deer picked its way through the clearing, pausing to look at her with liquid eyes before moving on. The morning air was cool and clean and filled with the scent of pine, and Rose realized something profound, that made her chest ache with bittersweet emotion. She was happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way she hadn't been in years, maybe in decades. She'd spent so long being who everyone else needed her to be. The good wife supporting Henry's career, the good mother raising the children, the responsible adult managing everything, the elderly woman who didn't cause trouble or make demands. She'd spent so long proving she was capable, hiding any weakness, managing everyone else's emotions about her aging. But here, alone in the mountains, with nobody to perform for, or accommodate or reassure, she could finally just be Rose. Just herself. Just a woman who was 93 years old, and still had preferences and needs and the right to choose how to live. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, this freedom. She had nobody to depend on but herself. Nobody to call if something went wrong. Nobody to help with tasks that were genuinely difficult for someone her age. But she also had nobody controlling her. Nobody making decisions for her. Nobody treating her like an incompetent child who couldn't be trusted with her own life. The freedom was worth the risk. The autonomy was worth the fear. Living on her own terms was worth everything. On the 5th day, after Rose had made the cabin reasonably livable and established some basic routines, she decided it was time to explore more thoroughly. She'd been so focused on immediate survival and making the space habitable that she hadn't really looked around carefully, hadn't searched for what Henry might have left beyond the basic furniture and supplies. Now she opened drawers and cabinets systematically, checking to see what resources she had, what she'd need to figure out how to obtain. And in the bottom drawer of the old dresser in the bedroom area, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time, Rose found a metal box she'd never seen before. It was locked, but the key was taped to the top with a note in Henry's handwriting. For Rose, when you come home. Her hands trembled violently as she lifted the box out, carried it to the table with the reverence of someone handling something sacred, and used the key to open the clasped lid. Inside was another letter from Henry. She recognized his handwriting immediately on the envelope, along with documents and other items she didn't understand at first glance. She picked up the letter with shaking hands, held it under the light, and began to read through tears that immediately blurred her vision. "My darling Rose," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you found the cabin. You came here. You chose yourself for once in your life, instead of doing what everyone else wanted. I'm so proud of you, wherever I am now. I'm so glad you're there in our place. I'm so happy you chose freedom. The documents in this box are critically important. First, there's the deed to this property, showing it's entirely in your name. Eleanor Hayes, your maiden name. I put it in that name 40 years ago when we first bought this place so the kids wouldn't find it if they ever went snooping through our papers looking for assets. This land, this cabin, these 5 acres are yours completely and legally. Nobody can take them from you or force you to leave. Second, there are bank statements showing the trust account I set up for you through my lawyer, Marcus Chen. There's $150,000 in there, separate from everything the kids inherited when I died. That's your money to live on for as long as you need, and it's structured so they can't access it, can't even find it. The trustee will ensure you have access to funds for bills and living expenses, but the kids can't touch it. You can live here comfortably for many years if you choose to. Third, and most important, there's a letter I wrote to be delivered to the kids if and when you want it delivered. It's sealed. You can read it if you want to know what I said, or you can just give it to them when you're ready. It explains everything. Why I set this up. Why you have every right to be here. Why they need to respect your choices and stop trying to control you. It might make them angry at first, but it will eventually make them understand. Rose, I hope you're sitting on that porch right now watching the sunrise like we used to do together. I hope you're drinking coffee the way you like it, strong and black with no sugar. I hope you're feeling the peace this place always brought us, the sense of being exactly where we belonged. And I hope you know that even though I'm not there with you in body, I love you completely and eternally. You gave me 65 beautiful years of partnership and love. I'm giving you this place as my final gift. Live here on your own terms for as long as you want. Be free, Rose. Be happy. You've earned it 1,000 times over through decades of putting everyone else first. Don't let anyone tell you what you should do anymore. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for choosing yourself. You're Rose Eleanor Harper, and you're the strongest, most capable, most wonderful woman I ever knew. Don't ever forget that, especially when people try to make you feel weak or incompetent, or too old to make your own decisions. All my love forever and always, your Henry. Rose sat at the table and cried until she had no tears left. her whole body shaking with the force of her emotions. Then she wiped her eyes, took several deep breaths, and looked through the documents Henry had left. The deed showing the property in her name, Eleanor Hayes, dated 1982, 2 years before they'd even told her they'd bought the place. Bank statements showing an account with substantial funds, more money than she'd ever had access to in her life, instructions for contacting the trustee who managed it, a sealed envelope addressed to Richard, Margaret, and Thomas Harper in Henry's handwriting. Henry had thought of everything. He'd given her not just a place to escape to, but the means to actually live there independently and with dignity. He'd given her financial security. He'd given her legal protection. He'd given her ammunition to use with her children if they tried to force her to leave. He'd loved her enough to plan for her freedom, even after he was gone. Loved her enough to protect her from their own children's well-meaning but controlling impulses. And Rose knew, with absolute unshakable certainty, that she wasn't going back. Not to Meadowbrook. Not to being managed and decided for and treated like someone incapable of her own life. She was staying here in this cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains for as long as she wanted and was able. She was choosing herself finally, after 93 years of mostly choosing others. And if her children didn't like it, didn't approve, didn't understand, well, that was something they'd have to learn to accept, because Rose Eleanor Harper was done asking permission to live her own life. Rose had been at the cabin for 2 weeks when the knock came on her door, shattering the peaceful solitude she'd been building. She'd been expecting it eventually. She wasn't naive enough to think her children would never find her, though she'd hoped for more time. The knock came on a Saturday afternoon while Rose was working in the garden behind the cabin. She'd found old gardening tools in the shed, had discovered ancient seed packets that might or might not still be viable, and was feeling optimistic about coaxing something to grow. The physical work felt good despite her age, connecting her to the earth and the seasons, like she'd been connected in her garden on Maple Street. When she heard the firm, aggressive knock on the front door, not a gentle tap but a demanding pound, her whole body went tense with awareness that her sanctuary was about to be invaded, her peace about to be shattered. She stood slowly, brushed dirt from her hands, pulled off her gardening gloves and walked around to the front of the cabin with her heart pounding, but her head held high. Richard's expensive black SUV was parked in her driveway, looking absurdly out of place against the rustic mountain setting, an intrusion of city wealth into mountain simplicity. Richard, Margaret, and Thomas all stood on her porch, their faces showing a mixture of relief and anger and confusion and frustration. They'd been worried, Rose could see that, but they were also furious that she'd defied them. "Mum," Richard said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, weeks of fear and frustration compressed into one word. "We've been looking for you for 2 weeks. Do you have any idea how worried we've been? How terrified?" Rose looked at her 3 children, all of them in their 60s now, all of them looking at her like she was a child who'd run away from home rather than an adult who'd made a choice, and felt a strange calm settle over her like a protective cloak. This was the confrontation she'd been dreading, the moment when she'd have to defend her decision and stand her ground. But now that it was here, she wasn't afraid anymore. She knew what she wanted, she knew what she deserved, and she knew she wasn't going to back down no matter how much they pressured her. "Would you like to come in?" she asked politely, as if they were guests she'd invited rather than people who'd tracked her down against her wishes. "Would we like to? Mum, we've been terrified." Margaret's voice broke with genuine emotion, tears visible in her eyes. "We thought something terrible had happened to you. We called the police. We checked every hospital within 100 miles. We've been searching everywhere for 2 weeks. And we've been trying to call you constantly, but your phone has been off," Richard interrupted sharply. "Why didn't you answer? Why didn't you let us know you were safe? Why did you do this?" "Because I knew you'd try to stop me," Rose said simply, her voice steady and calm. "I knew you'd come take me back to Meadowbrook or to one of your houses, and I didn't want that. I wanted to come here. I needed to come here." "Here?" Thomas looked around at the cabin and surrounding forest with obvious dismay and incomprehension. "Mum, this is the middle of nowhere. You can't possibly live here. You're 93 years old. It's not safe. It's not practical. It's not—" "I know exactly how old I am," Rose interrupted firmly, her voice taking on an edge they rarely heard. "And I've been living here quite successfully for 2 weeks, thank you. I'm managing just fine." "But how did you even— Where is this place?" Margaret asked, looking confused and hurt. "We've never heard of it. We didn't even know you owned property up here. How long have you had this place?" "Your father and I bought this cabin 40 years ago," Rose explained, watching their faces register shock. "We kept it private. It was our retreat, our sanctuary, our place to be ourselves, away from all the responsibilities and expectations. Your father made absolutely sure I'd have it, if I ever needed it." The revelation clearly stunned her children. They looked at each other, trying to process the idea that their parents had kept a significant secret from them for 4 decades, that there'd been a whole part of their parents' lives they knew nothing about. "Why didn't you ever tell us about it?" Richard demanded, his tone suggesting betrayal. "Why keep it secret for 40 years? "Because it was ours," Rose said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. "Not everything in our lives needed to be shared with you children. Your father and I were complete people before we were parents, and we remained complete people throughout your childhoods and adulthoods. We were entitled to some privacy, some space that was just for the 2 of us. Not everything about our lives was your business." "But Mom," Margaret tried again, her voice taking on that patient, concerned, condescending tone that made Rose's jaw tighten with suppressed anger. "You can't seriously plan to stay here permanently. It's not safe for someone your age. You're alone in the mountains with no neighbors, no nearby medical care, no support system of any kind." "I'm perfectly safe," Rose interrupted, her voice hardening. "I have everything I need here. Your father made sure of that before he died. He planned for this possibility." "What if you fall?" Richard challenged, moving to stand directly in front of her, as if his physical presence could intimidate her into compliance. "What if you have a medical emergency? What if you break a bone or have a heart attack or stroke and there's no one here to help you? You could die alone up here before anyone even knew something was wrong." "Then I'll die on my own terms in a place I chose," Rose said calmly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Which is more than you were willing to give me. You were going to put me in Meadowbrook, in a facility I didn't choose, to live according to someone else's rules and schedules. If I have to die somewhere, I'd rather it be here where I'm happy than there where I'd be miserable." "We never said you'd be miserable." "Yes, you did," Rose cut him off, her voice sharp with years of suppressed frustration finally breaking free. "That's exactly what you said when you put my name on a waiting list without asking me, when you decided my living situation for me without any consultation, when you talked about me like I wasn't in the room while you planned my future. You treated me like someone who couldn't make her own decisions anymore, like a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. You took away my dignity and autonomy, and expected me to thank you for it." Her children fell into uncomfortable silence, shifting on their feet, looking at each other uncertainly. None of them had expected this level of articulate resistance from their elderly mother. "Mom, we were genuinely trying to help," Thomas said quietly, his voice softer than his siblings. "We were worried about you living alone. We thought we were doing the right thing." "I understand you were worried," Rose acknowledged, her voice gentler now. "But worry doesn't give you the right to control my life. Good intentions don't justify taking away my autonomy. I'm an adult. I'm your mother, not your child, and I deserve to make my own choices about how I live, even if you don't agree with those choices, even if those choices carry risks you're uncomfortable with." "But this choice is objectively dangerous," Richard insisted, his lawyer training showing in his precise language. "You're 93 years old living alone in a remote cabin in the mountains. That's inherently risky by any reasonable standard." "Living is risky," Rose countered. "Being alive is inherently dangerous, especially at 93. I could fall in the shower at Meadowbrook just as easily as I could fall here. I could have a heart attack anywhere. But I'd rather take those risks and live on my own terms than be safe and controlled and miserable in a facility I didn't choose, surrounded by people I don't know, following rules I didn't agree to." She gestured toward the cabin behind her, inviting them with the sweep of her arm. "Would you like to see what I've done here? Would you like to understand why I chose this instead of the life you'd planned for me?" Reluctantly, clearly still upset, but also curious, her children followed her inside. Rose showed them the clean, organized space she'd created, with her own 93-year-old hands and stubborn determination. The kitchen with food she'd managed to get delivered from a grocery service in Boone that she'd found online. The living area with Henry's old books and comfortable furniture, and her chair positioned to catch the light. The bedroom where she slept better than she had in years. The wood stove she'd learned to operate again, remembering skills from decades ago. The bathroom she'd scrubbed until it sparkled. The generator Henry had installed as backup power. The well that provided clean water. "I'm not suffering here," she told them, as they looked around with expressions of reluctant surprise. "I'm not confused or lost or in imminent danger. I'm actually happier than I've been in years. This place, it reminds me of who I was before I became just your mother and nothing else. It reminds me that I'm still a complete person with my own needs and wants and the right to choose how to live my remaining years. But for how long? Margaret asked, her voice plaintive. How long can you really manage this kind of isolated living, Mom? A month, 6 months, a year, and then what happens? And then we'll see, Rose said. Maybe I'll decide I want to come back to town. Maybe I'll want help with some things. Maybe I'll accept assisted living at that point. Or maybe I'll live here contentedly until I die peacefully in my sleep at 110. I don't know what the future holds. But the point is, it should be my decision. My life, my choice, my terms. Not yours. She pulled out the documents Henry had left her. The property deed, the trust information, the bank statements. She laid them on the table like evidence in a trial. Your father set this up specifically so I would have options if I needed them, she explained. He knew you kids would eventually try to make decisions for me, would try to control my life out of love and worry. He wanted me to have a way to maintain my independence, to have real choices. This property is legally mine under my maiden name. The money to live on comfortably is legally mine, in a trust you can't access or control. And the choice of whether to stay here or go somewhere else is legally and morally mine alone. Richard looked at the documents, his face hardening as he realized Rose had resources and legal standing they hadn't known about, that they couldn't simply overrule her decision. Dad kept all this secret from us, he asked, his voice tight with anger and hurt. He planned this without telling us? He kept it private, Rose corrected, emphasizing the distinction. There's a fundamental difference, and before you get angry or hurt about that, you should know he wrote you a letter explaining everything. He knew you'd come looking eventually. He wanted you to understand why this matters, why he did it this way. She handed Richard the sealed envelope Henry had left, watching as her oldest son took it with trembling hands. He loved you, Rose added softly, all of you. But he loved me too, and he knew I'd need protection from your good intentions. Read it. Maybe it will help you understand. Richard took the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. The three siblings looked at each other, clearly uncertain what to do now that they'd found their mother not helpless, and lost, but calm and determined, and living quite competently on her own. We can't just leave you here, Richard finally said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. We'll worry constantly about you. Every day we'll wonder if something's happened. You'll worry no matter where I am, Rose pointed out gently but firmly. You worried when I was living in my house on Maple Street. You'd worry if I was at Meadowbrook. Different worries, but worry nonetheless. Worry is part of loving someone, but you can't let worry justify controlling them or taking away their freedom to choose. So what are you saying? Margaret asked, tears streaming down her face now. That we're supposed to just accept this? Just let you stay here alone in the mountains and hope nothing bad happens? Live with constant anxiety about whether you're okay? I'm saying you need to trust me, Rose said, her voice firm but loving. Trust that I know my own capabilities and limitations better than you do. Trust that I'll ask for help if I need it. Trust that I'm doing what's best for me, even if it's not what you would choose, even if it makes you uncomfortable. I'm asking you to respect my autonomy, even though it's hard for you. And if we can't accept this, Richard challenged, his lawyer instincts reasserting themselves. If we genuinely believe this is dangerous and irresponsible, what then? Rose looked at her oldest son with a mixture of love and absolute firmness, meeting his challenge directly. Then you'll have to learn to live with being uncomfortable with my choices. Because I'm not changing my mind, Richard. I'm not going to Meadowbrook. I'm not letting you manage my life like I'm a child who can't make decisions. I'm staying here, and you can either respect that and maintain a relationship with me built on mutual respect, or you can keep fighting it and damage our relationship, possibly beyond repair. That's your choice to make, not mine. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air of the cabin. Finally, after a long silence, Thomas spoke up quietly. Can we at least visit sometimes? Check in on you regularly? Know that you're alive and okay. Maybe help with things that are genuinely hard for you. Of course, Rose said, her expression softening with relief that at least one of her children was beginning to understand. I'm not trying to cut you out of my life entirely. I'm not trying to punish you. I'm just trying to live my remaining years on my own terms. You can visit. I'd like that, actually. Hey, you can call. I'll keep my phone on now that you know where I am. But you need to accept that this is where I'm choosing to be, and you need to stop trying to rescue me from a situation I deliberately chose. Her children left an hour later, still worried, still not entirely comfortable with the situation, but at least beginning to understand that their mother was serious, capable, and completely immovable. Richard took Henry's letter with him, clutching it like it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Rose watched them drive away down the dirt road, their expensive SUV looking even more out of place in reverse, and felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the confrontation was over, sadness that it had been necessary, hope that they might eventually understand and accept her choice. And underneath it all, quiet pride that she'd stood her ground, that she'd defended her right to autonomy even when it was difficult and uncomfortable. She went back to her garden, back to planting seeds in soil that might or might not let them grow, back to building the life she'd chosen at 93. 3 months later, Rose Eleanor Harper sat on the porch of her mountain cabin, watching the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains in a spectacular display of orange and purple and gold, and reflected on how profoundly her life had transformed. The transformation hadn't been easy or simple. There had been difficult days when her body reminded her harshly of her age, when tasks she'd once done effortlessly now required careful planning and frequent rest. There had been lonely moments when she missed the easy company of her old life, when the isolation felt heavy rather than peaceful. There had been nights when doubt crept in, when she wondered if her children had been right, if she was being foolish and stubborn rather than strong and independent. But those moments passed, and what remained, growing stronger each day, was a deep sense of rightness about her choice. Richard had called 3 days after visiting, once he'd read Henry's letter. He'd been emotional on the phone, angry at first that his father had kept secrets and planned behind their backs, then grudgingly understanding of why as Henry's words had sunk in. "Dad's letter was pretty harsh with us," Richard had admitted, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "He said we were treating you like property to be managed, instead of a person to be respected. He said we'd forgotten that you were a complete human being with needs beyond just being our mother. He said if we forced you into a facility against your will, we'd be no better than the men of his generation who treated women as property." He'd paused, the silence heavy with unspoken feelings. He was right, wasn't he? We were so focused on keeping you safe that we forgot to consider what you actually wanted. We took away your voice and called it love. Rose had accepted his words with grace, recognizing how hard they were for her proud oldest son to say. "You meant well," she'd acknowledged, "but meaning well isn't enough. I needed you to respect me, not just protect me." They'd talked for over an hour, really talked in a way they hadn't in years. Richard had apologized sincerely. Rose had accepted. They'd agreed on a visiting schedule. Once a month the children would come up together or in turns, bringing supplies, checking on the cabin, spending time with Rose on her terms in her space. The visits had been sometimes tense, sometimes warm, but they were rebuilding their relationships on a new foundation, one where Rose was respected as an autonomous adult, making her own choices rather than an elderly problem to be solved. Margaret had apologized during her second visit, sitting with Rose on the porch and crying genuine tears of regret. "I'm sorry we tried to control your life, Mom," she'd said, her voice breaking. "I think somewhere along the way we forgot you were a person with your own needs, and not just our mother, whose job was to be safe and accessible for our peace of mind. Dad's letter made me realize we were taking away your dignity in the name of keeping you safe, and that wasn't right. That wasn't love, that was control." Rose had hugged her daughter and felt something hard inside her chest finally soften. "I forgive you," she'd said, "but don't forget this lesson. Don't do to your own children what you tried to do to me." The cabin had become truly home now. Rose had planted a garden that was thriving in the summer sun, producing vegetables she ate with satisfaction. She'd bought a small television and arranged for satellite internet service so she could stay connected to the world when she chose to. She'd joined a virtual book club and made new friends who knew nothing about her age or her dramatic escape, who related to her as just Rose, another book lover with opinions worth hearing. She'd found a local doctor in Boone who made monthly house calls to remote patients, who'd examined her thoroughly and declared her remarkably healthy for 93, who'd adjusted her medications and given her advice, but never once suggested she shouldn't be living alone. She'd established a routine that worked for her body and her needs: early mornings on the porch with coffee, watching the forest wake up, gardening when her energy was good, reading in the afternoons when she needed to rest, simple cooking that nourished her, early nights because her body demanded more sleep now. She'd learned to ask for help when she genuinely needed it. Her children brought heavy supplies. A neighbor she'd met helped with repairs beyond her capability. The grocery delivery service handled what she couldn't lift, but she maintained her independence, her right to choose, her dignity. Was it sometimes hard at 93? Absolutely. There were days when her arthritis flared and every movement hurt. Days when she felt the weight of her age pressing down on her. Days when she wondered if her children might have been right about some things. But those doubts never lasted long enough to change her mind, because every morning when Rose woke up in her cabin, made her coffee exactly the way she liked it, and stepped out onto her porch to greet the day on her own terms, she felt something she hadn't felt in years before coming here. Free. Free to live at her own pace without judgment. Free to make her own decisions without someone overruling them for her own good. Free to be Rose, not just someone's mother or grandmother or elderly burden to be managed. She'd proven, to herself and to her children, that being 93 didn't mean being incapable or incompetent. That needing some adaptations and occasional help didn't mean needing total control. That independence wasn't about being able to do absolutely everything alone, but about having the right to choose how and when to ask for help. People in Boone had started to hear about the old woman who escaped to the mountain cabin, and a few had driven up the dirt road out of curiosity. Rose had been friendly but firm about her boundaries. Yes, she lived alone. Yes, she was doing fine. No, she didn't need rescuing unless she asked for it. Some thought she was brave. Others thought she was foolish. Rose didn't particularly care what strangers thought. She'd spent too many years living according to other people's expectations and opinions. Now, she lived according to her own. A journalist had even contacted her wanting to write a story. Rose had declined. "My story isn't for public consumption," she'd said firmly. "It's my life, not entertainment." Dorothy from the grocery delivery service had become a genuine friend. She was 68, sharp and funny, and had been deeply impressed by Rose's story. "You're an inspiration," Dorothy had told Rose during a delivery, sitting for coffee and conversation. "I'm scared of getting old, scared of losing my independence and having my kids make decisions for me. But you're showing me it doesn't have to be that way. We can fight for our right to live as we choose, even at 93. Fight is absolutely the right word," Rose had agreed. "Because people will try to take that right away, often claiming they're doing it for your own good. You have to be willing to fight for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable for everyone else, even when it makes people you love unhappy." As the sun dipped below the mountains now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of fire, Rose thought about Henry. She felt his presence here constantly, in every corner of the cabin he'd built and maintained, in the freedom he'd planned so carefully for her, in the love that had prompted him to think ahead to her needs, even after he was gone. "Thank you," she said softly to the evening air, to the memory of her husband, to the life she'd been given. "Thank you for knowing me well enough to know I'd need this. Thank you for loving me enough to give it to me. Thank you for respecting my strength even when others saw only my age." A cool breeze rustled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of mountain air and wild things, and Rose pulled her sweater closer around her shoulders. 93 years old, living alone in a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, exactly where she wanted to be, living exactly how she wanted to live, on her own terms. And that, she thought with deep satisfaction that filled her chest with warmth, was worth every moment of worry her disappearance had caused, every uncomfortable conversation with her children, every doubt and difficulty of the past 3 months. Freedom always had a price. At 93, Rose Eleanor Harper had finally decided she was worth paying it, and she'd been right. "I am deeply grateful that you stayed with Rose Eleanor Harper through her entire journey from being silenced and dismissed to reclaiming her voice and her life, from being treated as a problem to be managed to being respected as a person with the right to choose." If her story touched something deep in your heart, if you've ever been told you're too old to make your own decisions, if you've been treated as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected, if you've ever needed to prove that age doesn't erase your right to autonomy and dignity, leave one word in the comments describing how you'd fight for your own freedom if someone tried to take it away. Because Rose's story proves something powerful and true, that being 93 doesn't mean surrendering control of your life to others who think they know better. That fear of what might happen doesn't justify taking away someone's choices and autonomy. That living safely but miserably isn't really living at all. That the right to choose how we live our final years is sacred and worth fighting for, no matter who we disappoint or worry in the process. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that they're never too old to take back control of their own life, that their children or caregivers don't own them and can't make their decisions for them, that independence isn't about being able to do everything alone, but about having the right to decide when and how to ask for help. Because together we prove that dreams don't age, autonomy doesn't have an expiration date, and the right to live on our own terms is worth defending at 93 just as fiercely as at 33. Welcome to our family of people who refuse to disappear quietly just because someone else decided it was time. Welcome to our community of warriors who know that dignity and freedom matter more than safety without choice. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age.